Hello, I want to make a brief video on Unit 1 use of Camera Raw. We don't want to do any post-processing extensively with this unit, since this unit is really about taking the best photo we can right out of camera. However, some of you may elect to do some very limited post-processing using Adobe Camera Raw, and I want to talk about that process. So ideally by now, you have a FLICKr account and you understand how to upload images to it. You know that FLICKr accepts only JPEG images. On your camera, hopefully you have a camera that shoots camera raw format, things like NEF for Nikon, CR2 or CR3 for Canon, or ARW for Sony. And you know that you need to convert those files into JPEG in some way to upload them to FLICKr. So the workflow process that we have is you're going to use Adobe Bridge to get the images off of your camera and onto your computer. And then from Bridge, we'll launch them into Adobe Camera Raw if you desire to do some basic edits, things like cropping and very small exposure changes. Again, the reason we don't want to do a whole lot of post-processing at this point is because the idea of Unit 1 is to do the best possible images out of camera that we can from watching all the video resources and all the learning. So I'm going to start out with Photoshop, and I'm going to go ahead and launch Bridge. Now you can launch Bridge several ways. I'm just going to launch it through Photoshop's File menu to browse in Bridge. It may take a second for Bridge to launch through Photoshop. When it does launch, you will see the Bridge interface. And the Bridge interface, I'm going to find a folder where I shot a few images using a home lighting setup. Okay, so here's the directory I want to get into. I'm going to open that directory. And you'll see I don't have a lot of photos here. Some of you may have shot 75 photos for Unit 1, and they may all be in the folder here. So what I want to do, these you'll note again are all raw files. Oh, there's one Photoshop file that made its way in there. But most of these are raw files, meaning that if I were to double click on them, they would not open in any image editor. You need to have a raw processor. So I'm going to click on the raw files here, this one, and I'm going to click just the raw files because I want to select the Photoshop one. And I'm going to double click to open them. And you'll notice that Adobe will launch Camera Raw. Now, this is the new Camera Raw interface for 2020. If you have never run it before, it might ask you to set it up and install it first. And I can see across the bottom all my raw files and the one that we want to work with. Now, the reason we shoot in RAW is it uses 100% of your sensor's data. That's valuable. In other words, whereas a JPEG file will only shoot what the user elects to shoot, the entire sensor is used for Camera Raw. And that allows us some more post-processing after the fact. Let me show you an example here. I've got this image right here in the bottom, and you can see in background here there's a little notepad, looks like a legal notepad. There's some other stuff barely able to be made out in the background because of the exposure setting that the camera had when I took it. If I want to play with the exposure to see this a little bit, I can grab this exposure slider, and as I slide it to the left, I can see what it looks like if I severely underexpose it. You can barely see anything. Or I can slide it to the right to capture more of the scene. And I'm going to slide it over to the right to overexpose it. And I can see, oh, there's the legal notepad. You can see dust on my card table. You can see the window light coming in, of course, much brighter than it actually was. I can see a black bag in the background that I use as a makeshift backdrop. And I can see a really blown out, overexposed cup here. So the actual exposure I want to go with is probably something a little bit more around here. That's about 1.5 stops brighter than actually shot. So I'm going to allow that right there. And I would say for this unit, I don't want you to do too much other editing. If you want to do a very slight exposure of just a stop or two, I think that that's okay for this unit. The only other thing I really want for Unit 1 to allow students to do is to go ahead and crop things. So I'm going to go ahead and use the crop tool. Now you'll see over on the far right, here's the crop tool. And it's set to be proportional to the original shot. We can always change that up by changing the aspect ratio here. And I'm going to click and drag to get closer to the cup here. And then I can move it around a little bit as well. Something like that. And when I'm happy with it, I can hit the return key. Now, something to keep in mind, a lot of people get nervous about working in Camera Raw, is Camera Raw files, ARW files, NEF files, CR2 files, CR3, whatever, all those files are like digital negatives. You don't actually change them. I want to repeat that. You don't actually change them. What I have is still the original file here, and there's a sidecar file, they call it, that gets attached to this that says what all the changes were to the original file. So the original file is left alone. I can go back if I don't like it and delete that sidecar file and have that original file again. But kind of like what this is, I want to submit it for class. Again, I need to have those files as JPEG files. So that can be done a couple ways. Way number one, I can go ahead and click open. And this will launch this file inside of Photoshop. And now inside of Photoshop, I can see how the file looks, and I can elect to then save that as, and when we save it, I'm going to save it to the computer here. You can see all the different formats. I can save it in a Photoshop format. For uploading to FLICKr, you need to have a JPEG format. So I can save it as a JPEG here and click save, and we'll be done. That's, sure enough a fine way to do it, but one of the other ways I want to show you, especially if you're working like I do, and maybe you have 75 images in this folder, and you might want to, bulk upload them to FLICKr. Therefore, you might want to bulk convert them from RAW file to JPEG. Is to go ahead, and I'm going to browse in the bridge again, and I'm going to open all these, minus the PSD file again, inside of Adobe Camera Raw. I'm going to double click again, and it'll open them all inside of Adobe Camera Raw. I'm not going to do a lot of editing to this. A lot of these images actually do need it. But instead of doing that, what I'm going to do is select all these images, and I'm going to come over here to this symbol, and I'm going to tell it to save these files as JPEGs. So in other words, open up the Camera Raw file. I'm not going to do necessarily any work to these. I just want to save all 75 out now and make sure that they are JPEG files so that I can upload them to FLICKr. So I can go through here and I can say where I want to save them to, and I'm going to save them in the exact same folder that they were in. I can change the name, so if I want to change the name instead to the word cup here, cup, and then I don't want any other word there, I'll do that. I can say what file extension I want at the end. I want JPEG because I want to save these in a JPEG format. I can change some other settings, and at this point I don't want you to mess around with them. I'm going to go ahead and click save. And you'll see that it processed all those files, not a lot there, there's probably, 6 files, and save them as a JPEG in the same location. So I'm going to go ahead and click done here, and just to double check that, I'm going to browse in Bridge. And sure enough, you see, in addition to all my ARW files, I have cup, cup 1, cup 2, it renamed them, put the JPEG file format after it, and put them in the same folder. Now those JPEGs can easily be uploaded to FLICKr. Hopefully this helps you out. We're not going to do very much at all with Camera Raw in Unit 1. It's really the post-processing unit where we're going to heavily jump into Adobe's workflow. But this at least can show you how to do some really basic edits like exposure changes and cropping, and how you can convert things very quickly to JPEG so that they can be uploaded to FLICKr.